Hey everyone, welcome to the show Handing the Shame Back. This show is dedicated to all the survivors across the world who have experienced child sexual abuse. My name's Gloria Masters and I'm your host, and it's an honour to bring this to you. Every week I bring a survivor to you, and we do this so that you can hear stories and notice some similarities or differences to your own, but that mostly you're never alone out there. There are many of us who stand beside you in your journey. As always, there's a trigger warning. This is child sexual abuse after all. So if for any reason you do feel upset or anxious, please do stop watching. Go to the show notes below and you'll be directed to some resource and support. In the meantime, I have a fabulous guest for you. His name is Johnston. He's from Melbourne. He's a trauma-informed AOD, which is alcohol and other drugs clinician, and he's also a survivor as well as being a survivor advocate. There's a lot of words, but anyway, he's a great person. Welcome to the show, Reg.
Hi, Gloria. Thanks for inviting me on. It's a privilege to be here and tell my story to our survivor community that's out there, and hopefully dispel some myths and talk about what's worked for me and got me to the age of nearly 60. So,
well, no, it's great to have you here, and I think it's going to be a very interesting interview. So, Reg, as with all guests, my question to you initially is whatever you're comfortable to share about your child sexual abuse would be welcome. So if we perhaps start at the beginning, kind of what were family dynamics, where were you, how old were you, that sort of thing.
yeah, sure. Thanks, Gloria. I guess the scene kind of got set very early on in different ways, partly because I was born in the late 60s, the Vietnam War was going on, which might sound irrelevant at the moment, but I grew up with three older sisters, and my mother and my father. My father was a heavy drinker. My older sister was always very vacant. She wasn't around much, and didn't know why. I was just told she was at boarding school. And it turned out there was a lot of secrets in my family, and I didn't. My mother had sort of told us kids that both her parents had died simultaneously in a car crash, which 30 or 40 years later I realized wasn't true. And there was just lots of secrets and half truths and sugarcoating the truth. And then growing up in the 70s with three older sisters, there was the war, and I remember being told that when I was 19 I'd get drafted off to Vietnam, and there was a lot of very sort of anti-male movements at the time. Women's lib was taking off. I grew up with a sort of feeling that all men were rapists, all men were misogynists. That kind of male chauvinist pig talk was around a lot in the early 70s growing up. And then I remember my father having some rage towards my older sister one morning and being quite shocked by that. And then she was always in and out of our lives. And then my parents split for a while, and I was living with my three sisters and my mum. And my older sister I didn't realize at the time, she was actually grooming me. She'd let me see pornography, and I was 12, she'd talk about whether I ejaculated when I masturbated, and things like that. And then she helped me get a day off school one day to look after me. And we went into the city, and she was getting her methadone and using heroin. And we went home that afternoon, and, she invited me to have sex with her. So we ended up having sex. And, there's just a massive confusion of feelings around that. The access to pornography, I think pornography was quite powerful. It sets off all those hormones and fantasies and, processes around women and sex, and also growing up, I'd never really had a lot of privacy. Like, I'd be in the shower with quite a sheer shower curtain, and I'd have my mum and my sisters in there getting ready for work or doing their makeup, and I'd be trying to have a shower before school. So it was really mixed up boundaries, and that was kind of my normal,
Yeah. Yeah.
And then about, my sister would form oral sex on me and things like that. And in hindsight, I realized that she was probably a sex worker to support her heroin habit. And then about 6 months, well, then she did what she did. She would always disappear for months at a time. I wouldn't see her, and then I remember her asking, I asked her for sex one day and she just blanked me and gave me this look like, what are you talking about? And so that kind of rocked my head a bit, I guess.
Yeah.
And then, we're home doing the dishes one day. Mum and Dad had moved back together, and after school doing the dishes with the family, there's a knock at the door from the police, and they said, my sister had been found dead from a heroin overdose. And, my first response was, oh, you fucking bitch, you've left me with this dirty secret, So, from then on, and unfortunately, I probably told a few guys at school that I'd had sex, and when it came out who it was with, then I realized, oh my God, I've let this information out, So there was this mix of euphoria about enjoying sex and then realizing, oh my God, this is socially and morally kind of, very left field.
Yeah.
So, and of course, growing up with that kind of attitude that all men are chauvinists, I blame myself, because of my age, but because I was a male, I must have instigated this, And I remember years later, a therapist saying to me, if you were a 12-year-old, if you were a 25-year-old man having sex with a 12-year-old girl, who would you blame? And of course, yeah, you would blame the adult. But
Yeah.
I could hear that intellectually, but emotionally, it just took years to kind of reconcile.
So was your sister, was she 13 years older than you?
Yeah, yeah,
Oh, wow. Well, yeah. And look, it's first of all, wow, Reg. And, hello, wonderful survivors. We're very lucky to have Reg share this with us today because it's not often that we get someone able to speak of this, being an older sibling who's a female that was perpetrating the abuse. So, Reg, I can only imagine the confusion for you and the absolute what's going on. Because as a 12-year-old, you have no cognition. There is no way to really process this. You're just not able to.
yeah. I think, after it was only after I died that I found out she was actually my half sister, because I didn't know my mum had been married before and had my older sister to another man who subsequently died.
Okay.
So she was a single mum, and she was a woman of great Catholicism and church and blah blah blah. And it took me a long time to realize, well, if mum was so anti-sex, how is it she got pregnant to someone out of the blue, with all these moral and religious virtues? And then there's the lies about her parents, and then the big secret about my stepsister being, my half sister being a half sister, not a full sister, which from a sibling sexual abuse incest point of view kind of makes a slight difference, in some ways. But basically,
in what way would you say?
there's just some subtle difference, I think, for me, between a full blood relative and a half blood relative. I don't know why. Maybe it's a way of trying to mitigate it, perhaps.
Well, the coercive control, we can't underestimate the coercive control, and many of our survivors watching have experienced this type of control where you might be forgiven for thinking, well, I was 12 years old, I should have been able to say no, or I shouldn't have gone with her when she told me to or wanted me to. But the reality is, again, where you've got an adult, and she was an adult, our conditioning, especially back in the 60s and 70s, was do what you were told as a child.
Yeah, I think, for me, there's a lot of things. I mean, I think pornography had a big part in it. And I guess she used pornography as a way of grooming me.
Yeah.
and in hindsight, with the work I've done over the years, I realized that she was probably a victim too. I mean, all her symptoms are very absolutely typical of a sexual abuse survivor herself, the heroin addiction, probably sex working, she was married once for about 6 months. I didn't know until a few years ago that she'd actually had a child that died, because that was a secret. And the only reason I found that out was because I went and got her death certificate, because I wanted the truth. I wanted to know how because my mum would still deny that she died of a heroin overdose. She'd say, "Oh, her heart just stopped." And so, I went to birth, deaths and marriages and got, my grandparents' death certificates, and found out that my grandfather died in hospital and my mother's mother suicided. They didn't die simultaneously in a car crash. And then I got my half-sister's death certificate, and it shows that she died of a heroin overdose, And then it showed that issues she'd had a daughter.
Wow.
So for me, my own sanity, I guess, really, I had to go on this journey to discover what the truth was, because it's very cliche, but the truth sets you free, and you learn that your parents aren't always safe and nurturing. And, we grow up watching Disney cartoons or Disney movies and the Brady Bunch or whatever, where home is safe and nurturing. And, we're told this story that family is everything. And sometimes it's not. And I think that's a myth that people need to hear, that sometimes our families are dangerous and toxic, and it's okay to reject them.
Yes, and that's a really good point you raise, and I do want to come back to that, because often when people walk away from their family of origin, the criticism and the ignorance of people who don't know the story means that we are vilified and we are made wrong for doing so, and no one ever asks why. It's usually, how could you do that? You've only got one mother. Or how could you walk away from your family? They're your family.
Yeah.
And so I think what you're saying is really important, actually. Can I ask you, Reg, what the secrets and lies you grew up with? Now that you look back, and of course in hindsight we know everything, but now that you look back, what do you make of that in terms of a reason for it? Why were there so many secrets and lies?
I'll answer that in a sec, Gloria, but I think what's really important for survivors to realize is that, if we're abused as kids, we're trying to use a child's brain and mind and life experience to understand what we've gone through.
Yeah.
And it's only with an adult's mind that we can, as you invited me to do, look back and reflect and start joining the dots, and see how all these things have played out, and go back, as we've just done, and look at the adult perpetrator and the child trying to process all this information and all these events with a child's mind. And I know that the average survivor takes 22 years to disclose. So I think, I think to make sense of it, I've had to look at my mother's childhood, and something I do with the people I work with in drug and alcohol rehab, is invite them to look at their parents' parenting and the grandparents' style, and look for the patterns of either abuse or lifestyle or ignorance. Excuse me. And I think looking back at, I understand my mother's trauma, absolutely, and I understand my father's trauma. And through that, I can understand that they did the best with what they had. It wasn't great, but it was probably the best that they could do with the trauma they had. And that, I think my mum lied. Well, I don't know. I think my mum lied partly to try and make everything good, but also I've begun to realize that maybe if she's not a narcissist, she certainly has a lot of narcissistic traits. And they were probably born of her trauma. I mean, narcissism is usually an ego defense mechanism. And she's still in denial. She's 95 years old now, and she's still in denial. I hadn't spoken to her for 9 years until last year.
Yeah.
And just walked away again. It's like nothing's changed, nothing's going to change.
No.
I'm actually much better off without her in my life.
Yeah. And that's a big decision. We don't turn away from mothers or fathers lightly. So I can only imagine what led to that for you to make a decision of that importance. When you talk about your mother's trauma, are you able to share what that was or prefer not to?
To be honest, I don't really know exactly what it was because it's still wrapped in lies.
Okay.
There's,
Yeah.
the timelines don't add up, and my mother would never give me a straight answer. So it's like I have to be content,
Yeah.
and I think you shift from blame to compassion
Yeah.
when you actually start looking back at your parents and their childhoods and what they went through. You can actually start to have compassion for them, and then that creates self-compassion, I think,
Mm.
because you
I,
realize
yeah.
that they were parenting the best they could.
Yeah, and I think to a degree that's great, and that's perhaps at the upper end or the inmost end of healing. And of course, we do have amazing survivors watching who perhaps aren't quite there yet, and that's okay too. So any feelings are real. Survivors and need to be acknowledged and validated too. I think, Reg, as you're talking about your mother and kind of what hasn't been shared or what is true and what isn't, when there's so many lies and cover-ups, it's actually very hard to find out what the grain of truth is. I guess I did want to ask, when this was happening to you as a 12-year-old, were you ever able to share that with any, I know you told your mates, but any others, any safe adult, any?
No, absolutely not. I think it after she died, I think I just developed this desire to be dead by 21. I had no life plan.
Well,
I went through life going through the motions. I started drinking when I was around 15 or 16 and smoking dope and, ended up on the usual trajectory that we see, alcohol abuse, cannabis, amphetamines, and just high risk behaviors, lack of self-care, self-worth. And then also what also I think is really important for men is, and I've seen it with a lot of people I've worked with, is that you have a desire to be loved. Probably the one thing in life everybody shares is a desire to love and to be loved.
yes.
But then the dichotomy is that you develop a resentment against women. So you want to be loved, but actually you also resent the source of that love, which is girlfriends and women.
Yeah.
And then combine that with a really toxic desire for annihilation. And there are no boundaries. There is no true trust in a partner. Because how can you really trust a woman or when your mother and your sister have, abused that trust?
Yeah. How old were
Um,
you when your sister passed?
13.
Okay.
So she died about 6 months after we stopped having sex, and then she disappeared.
Yeah.
She was always in and out. She'd disappear for months or years, kind of thing.
No, she disappeared 6 months after she stopped abusing you, Reg.
Yeah.
It wasn't sex because your mind could not give consent to that which it could not really fully process. Sorry,
Yeah, it was
just
abuse.
need to
Yeah.
correct you. Yeah.
No. Yeah. Yeah. And I kind of wonder if that the abuse was part of her overdosing.
And the fact that she was so shocked corroborates that, doesn't it? When you asked her for sex, that her shock, her visible reaction. Mm.
Yeah, that recoil.
Yeah. So talk to me as well, please, if you're, and by the way, doing great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Please talk to me and the audience as well, if you will, about what you notice out there in this landscape where men are often viewed as the perpetrators and therefore demonized and vilified, and with sometimes little or no regard for the fact that between 28 and 32% of sexual abuse on children is perpetrated by women. So can you talk us through that, please?
Yeah, I think it's a really under-recognized or understood phenomenon. I mean, I'm lucky I read quite a few books. I met some people, I got clean and sober when I was 23 and moved to the UK when I was 25 and kind of started a whole new life and started reading up on sexual abuse and realized there were a lot of female perpetrators out there.
Yeah.
It wasn't just me kind of thing.
Yeah.
And obviously, I had a career, I've had a few careers, but I've always wanted to work in drug and alcohol rehabs, that kind of work, because I know there's so many people who are actually, drugs aren't the issue, it's the life problems that drive the drug and alcohol use. And to actually have these conversations with people talking about sexual abuse and men talking about sexual abuse is really a really important part of that work, because everything else is just putting band-aids on the work. It's about helping people process the trauma. And I've met people who said, I was 4 years with a psychologist and they just never asked me the question. And one of my opening gambits with clients is to say, in my experience, 95% of the people I work with have got physical, emotional, or sexual abuse in their histories. And if that's part of your story, we can work with that. So it's about, normalizing and validating people's experience. And that's kind of what worked for me, I guess. I've worked with a few people recently who have, been sexually abused by their mothers, by babysitters, by aunties, as very young children. And so to actually give people the courage to start talking about that and then realize that they're not alone, if you can think it, it's probably happened. Like there are so many different ways and forms that sexual abuse or emotional or physical or all three can take place.
Yeah.
And the research kind of shows that most people who use drugs and alcohol self-medicating some kind of emotional pain. That's why we use drugs and alcohol.
Yeah, and we know that over 85% of rehabs have childhood trauma at their core, and that includes, of course, child sexual abuse. So it's not difficult to connect the dots, but the reality is, and what you're advocating for is, the more we can normalize these conversations, not what happened, but the conversation around it, the more we actually are able to process it and have it seen as the silent epidemic it is across the world. Because make no mistake, this is in every corner of the globe, and it impacts up to 1 in 3, up to 1 in 5, whatever number you wish to throw at it, humans walking around the planet, and goes on today at a rate of knots with our children and grandchildren. So,
Yeah, and I think, an analogy I often use is if we were to sit down with a box of bandages and a group of people and everyone puts on a bandage so we can see their wound, we'd treat them differently. But with abuse, it's an invisible wound. We can't see it. But if we can have an awareness that people are carrying all sorts of wounds, we can treat them differently and know how to ask. I don't find them difficult questions, to start those kind of conversations, because I know how helpful it is. And if we have the courage to start those conversations, it gives people permission to step into that space and, start getting some relief around it and start, getting rid of self-blame, self-loathing.
and I love that you say that, because by its very nature, child sexual abuse is hidden, and it's usually perpetrated alone, which means that the shame gets to grow exponentially with the secret. And the interesting fact with that is it's not visible, it's invisible. So when you talk about it being visible, if we could put a plaster on it to denote, wouldn't that be something? But it's interesting because there's plenty of room across the world for people to have had a car accident and be treated accordingly and have some amnesia with that. But unfortunately, with this type of abuse or sibling sexual abuse perpetrated by a female or male, there's just not permission really to accept it. And I guess I'm wondering what you may have in terms of a response to that. Why is it that sibling sexual abuse is so hard for people to wrap their heads around?
think I think often there's a lot of myths around the safety of family. You know, we grow up watching movies, Hollywood, you know, TV shows where family is safe, it's nurturing, it's loving. We're constantly fed this idea that family is everything, you know, and it's all like whatever family members have done, you should forgive because they're family. And I think that's super, super unhelpful for people because they've got this abuse on one hand and they've got this myth on the other that, hey, suck it up, family's everything. Well, no, someone's raping me. You know, how can that?
Yeah.
Where's the justice for me? And it's about saying, well, that's not okay. It's never going to be right. And actually, sometimes families aren't safe, aren't nurturing, and aren't loving. And if that's the case for you, it's okay to reject your family.
Yeah.
Because, you know, people are called survivors because they're still alive. Everybody else is dead. That's why survivors have got the label survivor.
Yeah.
You know, and how many people do we all know who've died? You know, including my sister.
Yeah.
You know, I think, yeah, sometimes I think the term survivor is just not really understood by people.
I agree. And I don't think that the depth and the complexity of this type of trauma is understood in terms of being a survivor, because this can last, and survivors, I'm speaking to you as well, this can last the shadow or cast the shadow the length of a lifetime. We don't know when the next trigger's coming from. We don't know where we're going to be when a sound or a smell or the way a person walks towards us reminds us of that perpetrator. And we could be 2 years into our recovery from this, or we could be at the end of our life. We can't tell when this is happening. And I think it's really important to understand that complex post traumatic stress disorder is a real thing. And the reason it's complex, and Reg, I'm interested in your view on this, is because it impacts everything in our lives.
Absolutely. I think I'll just quickly pick up on amnesia that you spoke about. You know, I had a friend who was sexually abused in Victoria down in Warrnambool, and he'd been raped by a priest, and he remembered it in his late 50s. He started having nightmares and then suddenly remembered what had happened.
Yeah.
Recently, I was talking to a female survivor of sibling sexual abuse who'd been sexually abused by her brother. And, you know, I'd said to her a few times, a lot of her behaviors to me were very symptomatic of sexual abuse. And she said, no, it's not that. Fine. Okay. And then a few years later, she said, oh, actually, yeah, I was being sexually abused by my brother. And I said, you know, do you remember I asked you that question a few years ago? And they said, yeah. I said, well, what happened? She goes, I was watching a documentary on a swimming coach who was abusing kids. And I suddenly remembered, oh my God, that's what happened to me. You know, and I said, she goes, thank you for believing me. I said, well, I absolutely believe you. I always knew the what. I just didn't know the who, because I saw the symptoms, the self-harming, not doing great at school, not great, loving, healthy relationships with men. I knew I had a pretty good idea. And I did ask you the question a few years ago and you said no, and that was fine. So now everything, I said, even your little tattoo makes sense. It says protect your power.
Yeah.
You know, I said, I knew the what, I just didn't know the who, you know, and then helping that person move forward with that.
So, I think that's really powerful, and it's a nice little segue actually into what helped you so that we can perhaps give, as in you, can give our audience, please, some ideas or some tips that you yourself have benefited on as you've done your recovery and healing from this?
think I think, waking up around 21 or 22 years old when I'd just been, using lots of drugs and alcohol, losing jobs, having the police after me, car accidents that I'd survived. And, to be honest, it was a series of miracles where I probably should have been dead and I wasn't. And just waking up one day and thought, clearly I'm not supposed to die, So the only solution is to get well and get on with living,
Yeah.
And then, I kind of did that, but I had a lot of. We still have trouble with intimate relationships where trust is an issue,
Yeah.
and that trust will manifest as kind of love bombing.
Yeah.
Wanting to be loved, and then having this dichotomy about, can I really trust this person? And I've been working on it for 30, 40 years.
Yeah, of course.
So it is a lifetime journey. I don't think it ever goes away, but we get better at it. But what I was going to say actually is what was different for me probably was I didn't have that fear. My sexual abuse was felt different. I wasn't threatened. I wasn't coerced. I wasn't sort of taken physically and pinned down or anything like that. Whereas I know for a lot of people who were sexually abused in their own homes or their own beds, bed isn't a safe place. So people will have trouble sleeping. Whereas for me, I didn't have that really deep down fear that a lot of people have when they've been sexually abused. Do you know what I mean, Clara?
Yeah. I do know what you mean, but it doesn't make it any less traumatic or difficult to deal with, is I think the point. Because it is what it is, but it's this complexity and these levels and layers of it. Do I guess if I said to you, what would be 2 or 3 things that have really helped you as a survivor, what would you say?
Very simple. I guess partly getting abstinent, not using drugs and alcohol,
Yeah.
having a clear mind,
Yeah.
setting goals.
Okay.
So I know where my life is going.
Yeah.
But also, one of my first counselors said, the conversation about if the roles were reversed and I was a man abusing a 12-year-old girl, would it be any different sort of legally or morally? No, it wouldn't. And it's taken a lot of work to actually ingrain that belief. That's taken a long time. It's a long-term process. It's a journey, not an event, as we say.
Yeah.
And I think getting around other survivors is super important.
Yeah.
And hearing their stories and realizing that, it's not just us. We don't have it's not just us that has these thoughts and processes and difficulties with relationships or drugs and alcohol or holding down jobs or not being able to sleep at night or whatever. There's a whole community out there, very silent, very anonymous.
Well, it sounds like you're wanting to change that.
Well, I think, what I've decided is the purpose of my life is about the relief of suffering. That's how I see drugs and alcohol.
Yeah.
Working with people, because I know that a lot of them are sexually abused, physically abused. And how else would I want to spend my life except helping people move through that and relieve their suffering?
Yeah.
And, how do I honor my journey and my sister's life, by helping other people as you're doing?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's really powerful. So are you able to share with us the specifics around what you do in terms of your, not just your one-on-one, but maybe any group work or any teachings, or be very interested to know.
I think the lived experience gives you a real deep insight. I was working with someone recently who had shared about, he realized his drinking was about self-harm,
Wow.
and then the next night he talked about kind of the desire for annihilation. And I just said to him after the group can I ask you a straightforward question? Have you been sexually abused? He goes, yeah. He goes, but mum was atypical. I said, oh, why was that? And he goes, oh, it was my mother. I said, okay, yeah, cool. I said, would you like to do some work around that? And then a couple of days later, I took him up to a tree and with the group, just took the whole group up there and he just screamed and yelled, and swore and, tears and snot and all that, just let it all out. And to have that witnessed and validated by his peers and the support that they then wrapped around him. And then that gives other clients permission that it's safe to go there and safe to express it. And your story is not your shame. And your shame is not your shame. It's somebody else's that they've imposed upon you, as you say. That's the whole purpose of your handing back the shame to the perpetrator, not holding it, not us holding it.
Yeah.
Like we're to blame.
Yeah. And I think you're right, because every time we as survivors speak, whether it's to one other person or whether we're journaling or whether it's in a group, we are handing the shame back. And that is exactly right, because it never belonged to us. And I think that's, yeah.
I think something that's really helpful for people to recognise is the difference between shame and guilt.
Yeah.
Shame is the idea that I am bad.
Yeah.
Guilt is the idea that I did something bad. And no one was born bad.
No. No one is born bad. And it's interesting because, you referred earlier to the fact that when you can look back at your parents who may not have protected or may have been enabling, my term, because they weren't able to protect or look after the way they should have, what that can lead to is a feeling of anger. But as you said earlier, when you understand their history as well, that can then lead to compassion. And when you have compassion for your parents, you understand a little more about how and why they did what they did. And we know that not everyone is there or will get there. But I guess one question from me to you is, what is your view on forgiveness?
That's a really complex question because some abusers will never take ownership of their behaviour.
No.
So it's an abuser who has, remorse is much easier to give than someone who's going to live in denial, or is narcissistic and will never admit it or own it or believe that what they did actually had the impact that the survivor is saying that it had. There can be a real denial from perpetrators around the degree of damage they've done.
Yeah.
And again, there's no bandage to indicate that. It's an internal wounding.
And it's interesting you say that, because for years and years, and some of you survivors watching will know this, I held very strongly and angrily onto not forgiving. And I did that because I was furious, but also because there was no admission of any guilt or culpability. In the end, I chose to forgive. Why? For me. And I chose to forgive for me because the weight was sitting on me. And I realized I don't really care about those people. And they're not even thinking about me at this stage as an adult in my life. I'm holding on to all of this. If I forgive, it frees me, and it freed me. And that's all I did. So it's interesting. I don't see forgiveness as necessarily about me needing to forgive another person because it's the right thing to do or the big thing to do. I see it as, do it for me so I am free. I've carried enough of it. So it's just another twist on it. But yeah.
It's a classic idea of holding a resentment. A resentment only eats up the person that holds the resentment. It has no impact on the person you resent. They're oblivious to the fact that you're raging or
yeah
using up all this headspace with anger and resentment towards them. They're oblivious. They're getting on with their lives, and you're the one that's, resentment will literally eat you from the inside out.
100%.
That bitterness.
Yeah. And I think you alluded to the fact that your mother may have been religious, and we know that in established religions, there's often this very strong belief, or I see it as hypocrisy actually, about, you've got to do the right thing all of the time. And the reality is, unless you're the person doing the perpetrating or the enabling, and then you can do what you like. But Reg, just we're coming into the last sort of 3-4 minutes. Is there anything you would like to share with us? Any thoughts you may have, any areas we haven't yet looked at?
Say that if you're a survivor and you've got a problem with drugs and alcohol, that it doesn't need to, your drugs and alcohol don't define you. And it is just, they serve a purpose. They've been a way of coping, and you have a relationship with your alcohol and drugs. And if you need to give those up, well, there will be a grieving process. Like there'll be a grieving process for the childhood that you probably lost as well. And grief is a very, very tricky emotion to deal with. It comes in waves. It's not a simple process. But just keep doing the work, and there are safe people out there that you can do this work with.
Yeah. It's amazing. Well, I think you're doing wonderful things in the world, and it's such a privilege to have you here. So, Reg, if you stay there, I will reach out to the audience and close us out. So, survivors, it's very powerful and lots of learning when we have survivors like Reg on the show, who are able to share with some insight around not just what they experienced, but the impact it has, and then moving on to be able to support other survivors through this. And I think that's a real gift to the world. And look, he's said many things to us today, but I think there's a couple I want to bring back to you. And one is about the invisible wound, and how if it was visible and we could put a plaster on it, that would be that could be looked at and dealt with. And it's just given me pause about how really still to this day how hidden in the shadows this is. So I encourage you to perhaps find your own plaster and share, even with one person, or through therapy, or even expressing through any sort of art or physical activity, just what's happened to you. I think that's important. He also mentioned that drugs and alcohol don't define you. In a way, they were a means to an end. They helped you. And then when you eventually were able to move away from them, we can appreciate or acknowledge that was just a symptom of what we went through. So big ups to Reg all the way from Melbourne. But to all of you fabulous people out there, I see you, I stand beside you, and I believe you.